I'm Beth Pariseau, Senior News Writer at Tech Target, and this is IT Ops Query Season 2, The State of SecOps. Greetings, IT Ops Query listeners. Just a quick programming note, this podcast will be on hiatus on November 28th for the Thanksgiving holiday in the US and will resume the following Thursday, December 5th. Thanks for listening. Adrian Sanabria is the host of the Enterprise Security Weekly podcast and principal researcher at the Defenders Initiative, a firm he founded to feature and support decades of cybersecurity research. His career spans 2 decades in IT and then cybersecurity, where he has worked as an analyst, consultant, researcher, product marketer, product manager, and podcaster. Thanks for being with us, Adrian.
My pleasure. It's nice to be the guest. I host a lot of podcasts. So this is my third recording today.
Oh my goodness. Well, I appreciate
Yeah.
you coming on our little show. I wanted to talk to you because there's been some buzz based on an October Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, which we all know as CISA, report that questioned the data sources in some frequently cited reports about the value of quote unquote shifting left. And that's led some people to talk about shift left has been overblown and doesn't really have any basis. What do you think? Do you think it's been overblown?
I didn't have time to dig it up before we did this. I do recall somebody trying to trace back that everybody cites that it's cheaper to fix bugs closer to the source. As with many things, fat's bad for you. You see a lot of the same stuff in the health industry. I like making a lot of metaphors and analogies to health and food supplements and all that solve all your problems with a pill type of stuff. It's human nature, I guess. It was a good narrative, so we ran with it. And there's not a ton of good data. A lot of it's so contextual. It depends on how you develop code, how large your team is, what that development pipeline looks like. On the ground, you hear a lot of stuff like, we found this great tool, but it doesn't support .NET. There's a lot of little details that can stop you from getting good use out of a campaign like shift left. I think it's important to think about what we're saying when we say shift. It implies a responsibility shift, which is not necessarily a bad thing. I was hardcore on board with asset owners need to own security. It's silly for security to try and be an expert in everything. We can't be. There will never be enough of us to fix all of a company's security problems. So we need some help. But then if we try and give them the tools that are designed for us, which try to be comprehensive, it's just overwhelming for them. Now they need extra time to get their work done. We can't expect them to deliver in the same time scale if suddenly they have to look at 700,000 vulnerabilities getting spit out of a tool, right? So to some extent, they do look to us to help them prioritize that stuff. And it does end up being a collaboration, no matter how far you shift left. Unless we get to a point where AI is reliable enough to just kind of quietly fix things behind the scenes without input needed, we could get there for some very simple use cases and some very common bugs. Just a way spell check comes in behind us and changes things on us, right? Which everybody who's had that experience knows, maybe 70% of the time that's a good thing. And the other 30%, no, I meant to say the F word. Stop changing it to duck.
At least what I heard at KubeCon was similar to the mythical full stack engineer shifting into platform engineering, where the developer isn't going to handle the infrastructure. It also seems like the platform is becoming a place where security teams can collaborate with developers and SREs to add automated processes and security guardrails, but it doesn't seem like developers are really taking that into their own hands. Would you say that's what you've seen?
Yeah, it's not the developers' jobs. That's something I think we have to come to reckon with in cybersecurity, is that it is not the most important thing. And I think a lot of people still strongly emotionally believe that cybersecurity should be everyone's top priority. It should be the business's top priority. And it's not even close. Like, I'm not sure where it is. For some organizations, it might be different, but for many, it might be number 5, number 6. I was looking at Home Depot's website the other day just to kind of make a point here. And the closest I got to anyone responsible for risk was the general counsel. There's nobody in loss prevention, nobody in fraud, nobody in cybersecurity that even shows up on that list of 37 people. So yeah, just to make a point, where does it sit and how much can we justify spending time and money on this?
On that note, there was another spicy take in the same CISA report that hasn't generated as much discussion that I've seen, but that I found very interesting, that called into question the idea that security flaws cause people to stop using products.
And this is a direct quote. In general, it seems that quality failures don't always affect customer loyalty. And I think we've seen an example of that this year with CrowdStrike. So, what do you make of that? How do you think that'll affect this picture?
Again, I think it's kind of pulling our emotions out of it and saying, okay, what do
Mm.
we actually see in the market, right?
Mm-hmm.
Do we
Mm-hmm.
see people switching after a breach? And I think early on, when breaches were somewhat unfamiliar to people, we maybe saw some of that. Maybe Lowe's got some of Home Depot's business for a little bit after their breach. But also looking at the public markets, we now have a lot of proof that it doesn't really impact an organization's stock price long term.
Mm-hmm.
In
Mm-hmm.
fact, a lot of them, anything that causes a dip, if anything, causes it to go higher afterwards because you've got somewhere to build back up to. And if you think about in each of these cases, there's going to be some kind of risk reward ratio. If I'm using a streaming service and it has a really bad breach, and there's another streaming service that has 90% of the same content, and it takes me 10 minutes to quit one and join the other, yeah, maybe that's something I do. But if I've got 80,000 endpoints and it's a 3-year
Mm.
project and multi-million
Mm.
dollars to rip and replace CrowdStrike for Sentinel-1,
Yeah.
that's a lot tougher to do. It was a big deal for CrowdStrike too, not just its
Mm-hmm.
customers. And you have to ask yourself, what are the chances they're going to let something of this scale happen again?
Yeah.
That's something a lot of people in the heat of the moment, people were saying CrowdStrike's done. They're done as a
Hmm.
company in the heat of the
Mm-hmm.
moment.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, that's ridiculous because their customers have too much invested in it. It's in too central a place. It's too hard to rip and replace an endpoint security product, especially if you built a lot of things around it. You have it integrated into a lot of things. CrowdStrike does a lot more than just endpoint stuff these
Mm.
days.
Okay, so if shift left doesn't save money and security doesn't make money, what incentive do people have to improve their security operations?
Less than we thought. Less
Huh.
than we thought they did.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
considerably less. Like I often ask people, how many breaches do you think Dropbox has had?
Mm. I
And
don't know.
nobody knows the answer. Nobody
Right.
really cares. It's a lot. It's at least 7, but who cares?
Does that mean that consumers just have to live with kind of the assumption that everything's going to be breached and nothing is secure?
No, I think there's definitely, and we're just now seeing regulations catch up to this.
Yeah.
Like a lot of this stuff can be avoided. GDPR is a fantastic example. Not just GDPR, but FTC. If you look up FTC complaints in the SEC, they've
Mm.
levied a lot of fines. We saw the
Mm-hmm.
CEO of Drizzly get sanctioned personally for the next 20 years of his professional career, regardless of what company he works for collecting too much consumer information. So already we're seeing regulations kind of shift this idea, like a business kind of naturally hoovered everything up because data is valuable. But now, if we can also make data a liability, we can make businesses think about it differently and think, I can't wait to get rid of this data once I don't need it anymore or not
Mm-hmm.
collect it in the first place because it can result in a fine to me. It can result in an outcome that I want to avoid. I think regulations are going to help a lot here, but where CISA is recommending things and suggesting things, and it adds 10x to the time, money, and effort to finish a project, particularly in companies where you feel lucky to get the project out the door at all.
Mm.
It's just too much of a burden, particularly if there's not a lot of evidence that you might have some kind of loss tied to it. And the more and more evidence we get, I think the more and more we realize where our time is better spent.
So, where is our time best spent in cybersecurity? The CISA recommendations all fall under the heading of secure by design, and it's a nice idea that you would design security in from the beginning and not have to constantly be playing whack a mole with attackers later. But where is the time best spent in your view?
Yeah, if capitalism wasn't a thing, that might work, right?
Right.
But you have competitors, and the moment a competitor thinks, you know what, Dropbox had 7 breaches, we can weather some to get this to market quicker. Now you're not competitive anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And we saw companies try and use security as a competitive advantage, and there might be niches where you can do that. There are places definitely where security is more heavily favored. Certainly, if you're choosing a cryptocurrency wallet or something like that to use, that might be because it's literally protecting cash that can be instantly lost forever. But you mentioned SREs earlier.
Yeah.
So I find it fascinating that through DevOps, through Agile, containers, cloud, all these trends we've seen in IT, in pursuit of performance and resilience, we've seen more security wins than have come out of the security industry proper, I would
Mm.
argue. Now we have ephemeral infrastructure, we have immutable infrastructure, we have cloud first organizations who are confident they could rebuild all the company's infrastructure in a day. because they've got infrastructure as code and things like that.
Hmm.
So this idea of resilience as making the business strong enough to weather all kinds of failures, I think is very attractive. And all of a sudden, if my infrastructure is ephemeral and I detect an attack, then I can just destroy and replace it rather than trying to fix every single vulnerability that I might have in my environment. But that means we have to get really good at two things. We have to have permission to break things and to fail often so that we can get better from it. And then visibility, we've never done a really good job or as good a job as we need to. Because if we're going to worry less about vulnerabilities and more about making sure we can keep the business up and running, then we have to get really good at detecting attacks when they happen and having the ability to respond to them and do something about them. If we're going to accept, even if you do shift left perfect, some stuff is going to make it through. So we still need to be good at detecting and stopping attacks. And I think, again, that's something we've traditionally not been good at. And you have to do a lot of practice. I equate it a lot to sports. Like a lot of companies do one incident response test a year. They don't do any real attack simulation. When the pen test comes in and they have their annual pen tests, they don't use that as an opportunity to see if they can spot that stuff, maybe stop the pen tester. So there's a lot of opportunities here that I think we've traditionally been passing up. Like if we look at ransomware, for example, the average ransomware case, if you look at the techniques being used, how they do it, how they go about it, yeah, maybe the ransomware is somewhat sophisticated, but everything else just looks like a mediocre pen test from 10 years ago. And we've been having mediocre pen tests for decades in this industry. We should be able to detect and stop one by now, but we can't.
How do we get there? Or do we?
I think, again, it's practice. A lot of tools get deployed and not tested. A lot of controls get deployed and not tested. Again, when you look at security, much like a lot of software projects, we stop when we get to functionality. When it's up and running, when the green lights are on, okay, we're good. It's kind of similar to anybody can learn how to drive, but there's some people who learned how to drive and know how to change a tire. And some people that only know how to operate the car. They don't know how to deal with all these different situations you can have driving a car on the road. And a lot of that depends on how big of a pain in the butt your parents were about, no, you have to, we're going to change the tire right here on the side of the road.
Yeah.
And you're going to learn how to do it. And that's a lot of it, is that kind of extra work that it takes to have the confidence that if bad things happen, you know how to handle it.
Is that also a place you think maybe AI could be useful, or observability tools are evolving? Any tools there that might help?
Yes, because in a lot of cases, the observability tools are missing stuff. And you don't want to find out that you're missing stuff, Microsoft, in the midst of the incident, right? The reason I call out Microsoft here is they've had problems figuring out their own incidents because they didn't have enough logs, because they only had 30 days worth of logs. And I've run into several cases where companies were using Microsoft and the logs were never enabled in the first place because the default is for logs to be off. Imagine for email in Microsoft 365. I don't know what the default is today, but many years ago, I was doing a BEC investigation and they were off by default. So we had no idea when the attackers got in, what they did, how they moved around. And so we turned on the logs during the investigation. So when it comes to observability, sure, you can turn on a whole bunch of stuff. You can stuff a whole bunch of events into some kind of log management system, into a SIM, but you should know what's important in there and what's not. You should know if you have everything that you need in there. And again, the only way to do that is to go through this practice, and maybe we can use AI to simulate some of these attacks to help us do that. I think today the best way to do it is with purple teams, red teams, with experienced professionals simulating real events that have happened. There are some tools out there that will simulate some of these threat actors and events also, and just systematically go through and say, okay, what did we miss?
Right. So this season of my podcast is called The State of SecOps, and I've been asking every guest what they think in general is the state of security operations and where they see it going from here in the near future, a year to 5 years out. So what do you think?
I think everything we've been talking about is going to help mature it. I'm still somewhat of the opinion that the SOC is a symptom of a problem that the industry created. We created this massive amount of information with more of a priority on quantity than quality. So this idea of not really knowing what the customer wants, like there's many different use cases for a SIM. Compliance is one of them. There are many use cases that push you to include as much data as possible. And it's interesting because it did kind of lead to this XDR market where XDR is saying, how about we only get the attack data, the stuff that's important for detecting and remediating an attack, and all that other data can go somewhere else. So you almost have what's more of a specialized security operations SIM product with XDR. And there's still a lot of triage work to do there. And we're seeing 2, 3 dozen companies purporting to replace that tier of the SOC. For some people, it's don't have tiered SOCs. Some people do. But kind of the concerning thing there is if we make that go away with AI, that piece that just determines, is this a problem? Is it not? And if it is, who do I hand it off to? It might be that we find that AI can automate that. Then where do people come into our industry? Because that's traditionally where all the new people come into the industry, is in these junior SOC roles that 3 dozen companies say they're going to make go away.
Yeah, and then you get into what some people call a skills shortage. I've heard people dispute whether there really is one, but there is an issue with finding enough people to run things. Do you think there's any solution to that on the horizon? Do you think AI is the answer?
No, because in order to implement that AI, to tune it, you do need those
Mm,
people. Even if you train AI off those people, say the vendor has those people and they train the
mm,
AI, you still have what I call the cost of customization. The fact
mm-hmm.
that I'm going to sell my security product, and if it's something general like SIM, like SOAR, it's not very specialized. It's not very customized to the company I'm selling it to. And each company has different weird things going on. A true positive for one company might work perfectly well, or it might result in millions of false positives for another. So there's this huge amount of customization you have to do to make a lot of these tools useful in an environment. And any kind of AI that comes out of that black box is going to have to be tuned for these environments. And you can't really self tune them. There's too many contextual pieces there. We've seen machine learning used where it's supposed to train itself, find network based anomalies and stuff like that. And every case I've seen, I've actually tested some of these products up close. It doesn't work because there's too many factors. There's too many contextual things that it doesn't have access to. There's too much of that institutional knowledge that doesn't live in any system, where somebody will tell you, oh, it's just a weird way of how we have our firewalls configured. They just do that. I forget why we tuned them that way, but if we change it, this thing over here breaks. And
Mm-hmm.
there's so many of those little things. So I don't know, maybe for cloud first companies where they don't
Mm.
have all these weird legacy situations, some of that could work. But we've been seeing IT going that direction for a while now, where it's almost two different flavors of IT. The cloud first, everything in a container, immutable infrastructure, disposable, ephemeral, and is just a completely different world from your traditional, every process, every application has a dedicated Linux host or Windows server.
Mm-hmm.
Delta was talking after the CrowdStrike thing about having 40,000 Windows servers that they had to recover manually with BitLocker keys. And the first thing that occurred to me is, well, there's your problem. Any environment where you have 40,000 distinct individual Windows servers, even if they're VMs, is going to be a management nightmare at some point. At least half of those should be containers or something at this point. You've got to redo that infrastructure, or yeah, you're going to have management nightmares that your competitors aren't going to have.
So, where do we go from here as a collective industry, especially those people with the technical debt that you describe?
I don't know if it's going to be that big of a competitive difference that they're forced to
Mm.
change in the future.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like they would be. More and
Mm-hmm.
more, the way we see industries being displaced is by companies who are first and foremost a software company, everywhere from automotive to manufacturing, where you can eliminate in-person offices and things like that. And with AI, it'll probably be accelerated a little bit more. But I don't know, maybe there's still industries where they can get away with having legacy on-prem data centers and infrastructure and it doesn't affect them as much. But I think they should at least be looking at adopting these newer principles. There's a book a CISO talked me into reading called A Seat at the Table, and it's about the role of the CIO. And are you really sure you want a seat at the table? It talks a lot about DevOps and Agile, and all these new technical trends are kind of breaking the management model of IT, all the way up to that executive role of the CIO. And I think a lot of that rings true in security as well. The lead role, the CISO role in security is very shaky and up in the air at this point. We see a lot of people don't want to be a CISO anymore, particularly not at a public company where there's a lot of
Mm-hmm.
personal liability and where their responsibilities are so broad. Like I hear of CISOs who now have to worry about fraud, who have to worry about AI safety. Their
Yeah.
responsibilities just expanding so much that we might have to break up the role. And already we see companies breaking off chief risk officer, chief privacy officer. Maybe there's an AI officer.
Mm.
It doesn't seem to be tenable the way that we're doing it now. So yeah, technology changing is forcing changes in these other places. So I think we're going to continue to see a lot of experimentation in terms of how we manage people and hire people,
Hmm.
down to those specific technical processes of shifting left and how code makes it from software engineer to production.
Great. Well, I really appreciate your insights as always, Adrian. Thanks for being with us. This has been IT Ops Query Season 2, The State of SecOps. If you have any feedback on this episode or want to share questions, comments, or stories we should consider covering, please reach out to me at B as in boy, P as in Peter, A-R, I, S as in Samuel, E-A-U at techtarget.com. Please consider rating, reviewing, and subscribing to this podcast on your platform of choice. And tune in next week for our continued conversations with industry experts about the challenges facing security operations. Thank you for being with us so far.